So looking today specifically at Psalm 40 that we've just read, but I did mention earlier in the service that my plan is to look at the Messianic Psalms. I wonder if this is something you've heard of. It's very easy for us when we look at the Bible or we think about the Bible to spend a great deal of time with those familiar stories. And we spend a great deal of time, I think, with the teachings of Jesus and the Gospels because we know them, they're simple stories. This is opportunity to explore a little deeper in something that we're not perhaps familiar with. Here's a definition I found which I thought was useful. So the Messianic Psalms are where there is a reference to the Messiah in a psalm and it is applied to Christ and expounded in the New Testament. Sometimes a whole psalm applies to Christ, sometimes a paragraph, and note that they quote part of Psalm 40 that we've read today, sometimes a single verse. That's the definition that was given. So, how is Psalm 40 messianic? How does it refer to the Lord? So let's look at this, the verses 6 to 10. Now there's a lot of text on this slide. I'm certainly not going to expect you to read it all at that size, but I'm just going to point out a couple of particular phrases and sentences in here, and not in any particular order. So the first one is this: in the scroll of the book, it is written of me. And that, I think, is something that we can say is uniquely relevant to the Lord himself, that the Bible speaks of the Lord. But it is also relevant to us. And one of the things that we learn from the teachings of the church is that the pattern of life the Lord went through, we call the glorification, also applies and is a pattern of our regeneration, our spiritual development and growth. So whilst this sentence does specifically refer to the Lord, it also speaks about our spiritual journey. Then you might have noticed sentences like this: sacrifice and offering you did not desire, I delight to do your will, O my God. Now these couple of sentences and the verses around them are quoted in the book of Hebrews in chapter 10. And then the writer of Hebrews makes this comment: he takes away the first that he may establish the second. It's speaking about the way the Lord came into the world and he replaced the sacrifices and the ritualistic system of the Jews' worship with something far deeper and far greater. This is the point that's being made here. Other sections. I focused on verses 9 and 10 here. I've proclaimed the good news. And this reminds me of the Lord in the synagogue when he stands up and he speaks and he quotes from Isaiah. But then elsewhere in the psalm I also see other things. And I noticed this section of verse 15. Let them be confounded because of their shame who say to me, aha, aha. And this reminds me of the Lord on the cross. Do you remember the story? When the Lord is on the cross, there are many people who say, oh, let us see if he can bring himself down. Let's see if he can save himself, the man who saved so many. So I felt this too reflects the life of the Lord. But then I wonder how you deal with a sentence like this: my iniquities have overtaken me. Does that too speak of the Lord? That article that I quoted before, it is obvious that some of the Psalms are occupied entirely with the person and the thoughts and feelings of our Lord, while others clearly referred to the experience of the psalmist. So he says in Psalm 69, when David exclaims, O God, thou knowest my foolishness, and my sins are not hid from thee, he obviously is referring to himself. The implication there is that has nothing to do with the Lord. I just mentioned one of my colleagues, Reverend Julian Duckworth, and I remember Julian on one occasion saying the book of Psalms is like the spiritual diary of the Lord. This is everything the Lord goes through. So we do believe this has some relevance to the Lord's life, but this is expressive of what we call hereditary evils, evils the Lord received from his human mother, but not evils that the Lord acted out of. So he shares the same tendencies towards evil as we do, but he was always victorious. He always conquered them. But he would have felt those evils every bit as intently as we do. And I think that's important for us to remember. Because when we talk about hereditary evils, it can be kind of academic. And we kind of think, oh, they're not real. But they are. They do impact us, and they did impact on the Lord. So that's all about the Messianic Psalms. But I just want to show you something else that could be read about all of the Psalms. And I think this is what I really want you to take away from today. We read the Psalms in the New King James Version. And if you grabbed one of the Bibles, such as we have in the cupboard at the back of the church, you will notice, if you turn to Psalm 40, that there are two headings. So the first one here is faith persevering in trial. And the second heading is to the chief musician, a psalm of David. Now, do you know the difference between the headings? Okay, an important thing to remember. The first heading here has been inserted by the translator to give you a sense of what the psalm is about. The second heading, however, is part of the text. You actually find it in the Hebrew text if you look at the Bible. As we're reading the Bible, we can note what the translator says about the psalm, but we don't necessarily pay a great deal of attention to it. The second heading is far more important. Now, I mentioned in the children's talk about this idea of the first words carrying on into what follows, and I'm just going to show you that. This is the interlinear Bible. So this is presented quite differently from the Bible you're used to reading. It presents the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, in this case Psalm 40. Now what you need to bear in mind when you're reading this is that Hebrew is read from right to left. So if you look at the English, because what they've done is they've presented the Hebrew and they've put the English translation of each word underneath it, you'll notice that it reads from the right-hand side to the left. So, to the chief musician of David, a psalm. Patiently I waited for Yahweh. You see, you've got to read it from this side to that. So we've got the heading, to the chief musician of David, a psalm, and then we begin what we regard as a psalm proper. And we begin with the word patiently. What I want you to notice that in actual fact, the word patiently is the same as the word I waited for. If you notice, right at the top of those little boxes, there are two numbers. The numbers are Strong's numbers. They refer to a particular word in the Hebrew. So James Strong created a dictionary of Hebrew words, and he gave each word a number to make it easy to work out what word is what. Notice that they are both 6,960. They are both the same word. I want you just to realise that the word patient, we translate a couple of different Hebrew words as patient. So one of them is literally translated as long or slow to anger. That's a sense of patience. And you can imagine that, slow to anger. Another word is translated as bear. Okay, to bear. It also means to whirl or to dance, but it's the sense of holding something and having to hold it for a long time. But when we turn to this word, which is translated here as patiently, It is translated in a couple of different ways elsewhere. It's translated as wait, very clearly, but it's also translated as to look for or expect. And it's also translated as gather together. Okay, to look for or expect, to gather together. And let me read some of the words that are used of this Hebrew word. Probably originally means twist, stretch, of tension, of enduring, to be strong, strength, to remain, to await. And it also speaks of a spider's web. You think of a spider's web, how it is tight. And that is the picture that's being described here. And we go back to the psalm, and one of the ways we could translate this phrase, I waited patiently, is I waited waitingly. You understand? I waited waitingly, or I waited in a waiting manner. But remember the idea of tension and strength that is encaptured in this word. It carries a sense of anticipation. It carries a sense of preparation. It carries a sense of being ready for action. Now, I also want to mention that when we think about the Psalms, this is not really the first word of the Psalm. The first word of the Psalm is this one. Remember that heading. So we discarded the translator's heading, we go to the Hebrew heading. This is really the first word of the psalm. Now, to the chief musician doesn't seem very relevant, does it? But the word means preeminent or enduring. Enduring. And that relates to this word for waiting patiently. The Kempton translation of the Bible translates it to the victor, the one who is victorious. And if I bring that all together, it reminds me of this. In the book of Hebrews again, we read, "Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher," or alternatively, the originator and perfecter of our faith. I want to say when we read this psalm and as we read that passage from Paul, there is a readiness for action which is implied here. But there is also an acting when called upon. So it's not a passive waiting for the Lord. We're not sort of standing there with our hands by our sides and doing nothing. We are prepared, we are ready for action, and when the Lord calls upon us or gives us opportunity, then we act. And then we recognize that the Lord is the one who brings us success, who brings us victory. And I read that throughout this psalm. The psalm is both a cry to the Lord for help. It is also a preparation of oneself for action, to obey what the Lord will call us to do. So I'm going to read another section from Paul, a well-known section from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul writes this, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Friends, let us prepare for the Lord. Let us be ready for action. That's what Psalm 40 calls us to.